Hey guys, welcome to the final
grand finale
podcast of Noetic's musings on free choice of the will by Augustine. And man, what should I say here? All I can really say is that this has been a really wild ride. Like I do at every podcast, I have things to start out with, but I think things proceed well if I sort of cast it to my co-host first. And I don't know, in the review of the podcast, Jordan, and in your review of the readings or anything like that, is there any conceptual clarification that you needed from me? Or is there anything that you wanted me to expound upon? Were there things that we maybe left out from last time that you found interesting? I don't know. I'm going to shut up. What do you think?
Well, listening to our podcast from last week, we got really hung up on natural sin, right? And I think that we'll find that the material for this podcast will cover it. That's pretty much it for me.
I hope so. I think we, when I went back and I listened to last podcast, I felt like we accomplished a great deal because we addressed the issue of natural evil in a way that I don't think Augustine in a clear way does it. And I think that was in large part because of your musings on the matter. I wonder if
thank you.
Yeah, I think it definitely helped to have that conversation with you. I wonder if what we do today is going to problematize it again, though. Like I at the end of last podcast, I sort of illustrated the distinction between moral and natural evil, and you had sort of I don't want to say a blasé sort of response to natural evil, but you were sort of comfortable with the way that it fit within the divine schematization, and I took a lot of solace in that. But then in these last couple chapters, Augustine ends up talking about the devil again. And I'm just like, oh man, did he just throw like a massive monkey wrench into everything that we accomplished in the penultimate Augustine podcast? So I don't know. Enough sort of meditation on our feelings and things like that. We should probably just jump right into it. There were two things that I wanted to talk about at the outset. And a lot of it has to do with this, and maybe we can only say so much about it. Because the second one, I think, is something we can say something significant about. So the first thing, and let's just bracket this for right now, and we'll come back to it throughout the podcast. And this actually came from CJ. So, what I love about CJ, I've done the Nietzsche and Schiller podcast with CJ, and he listens to our Augustine ones, way to go,
CJ.
Yeah, he gave us this very attentive question. He wanted to know, how does Job complicate what we've said about evil and original sin in Satan? So the story of Job. Mm-hmm. And obviously in that scenario, God and the devil, they make this sort of wager.
Right.
Satan asks God, or God says, look at my servant Job. He is such a righteous and devoted man. And Satan says, he's only that way because you've bestowed such fortune upon him. And then God abandons Job to the devil's ends, with the exception of the devil not being able to kill Job. The devil takes everything away from Job. Job still does not divorce himself from God. And then God makes everything right again by restoring all his properties and wives and children and all of this, whatever. So I think we'll want to talk about that maybe at the end. Sure. But I thought that was a really interesting thing that CJ pointed out.
CJ.
Yeah. The thing that I think we should dwell on first before we get into the new material is to finish up something from last podcast. If you've been following along, last podcast we got kind of kicked out of our room, and we didn't get a chance to apply Augustine's own litmus test to his 4 different views of the soul. So, Augustine doesn't do it. He doesn't think it's very interesting. I think it's profoundly interesting. And I think we wouldn't really be doing a discussion of the text proper if we didn't revisit this in a non-rush fashion. So if you can remember from last podcast, the 4 itemized views of the soul that were undecided at that time by the church and that Augustine takes time to point out to us was that propagation brings souls into existence. 2, a soul is created for each person born. 3, souls exist elsewhere and are commanded into a newborn. And 4, souls attach to bodies at their own discretion. Now, before Augustine applies his litmus test, I said that the second and third views were second and third views were the least problematic. Namely, for the first view is that the propagation of souls seemed to bring into this notion that sin was sort of transmitted between souls, and the understanding that we have of original sin is that sin is something that is of the body. The body is corrupted and souls are sent into the body to rescue it, but propagation may stain the soul. So I thought that was contradictory to some of the things that Augustine said earlier on original sin. And the fourth view... Yeah, the fourth view was that I thought if souls just sort of on their own free will...
Yeah, I picture them just kind of flitting about, kind of just drifting into bodies, drifting out, which seems aimless.
Right.
And takes away that agency that Augustine really just expounds and just talks about so much.
Well, it gives so much agency to the souls, but I wonder if that is at odds with God's dominion. And that's the problem that I had with it. I didn't have a problem with it taking away agency. I had a problem with it giving too much agency to the souls.
Oh, that's so interesting, because my concept was the opposite. Because to me, it almost seemed as if bodies just randomly drift in and out, then that just... You could just say, oh, well, I don't know, my soul might just leave my body right now, so I'm not really to blame for what I do with it.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems like, I guess we're told throughout the entire book that humans have a very privileged status for God, and if it's sort of accidental, if he doesn't really intend for them to be ensouled, then it just seems kind of, I think it sort of seems like we're sort of reduced to these forgotten children again. That's why I found the first and the fourth views to be problematic. Not that they're not tenable, but it seems to be in tension with what Augustine has said thus far. But that aside, Augustine gives us a litmus test for determining what the right view is before he gives up on it. And he says, look, this is a waste of my time. I got other things to do. Somebody else can deal with this. And the litmus test, do you recall what the litmus test was off the top of your head? It's probably hard to remember. I've got it written
it's
down
here. It's just in your notes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like if you're listening to this, understand that I'm not doing this from memory. I have 100 pages of notes on this stuff. So, the litmus test for the right view of the soul is one. The view has to maintain that God's creation is the only changeable form. So the soul can't evolve. Okay? The second thing of the litmus test is the view cannot impute changeableness into God at odds with God's eternality. And 3, cannot challenge the Trinity. So let me say that again. God's creation is the only changeable form. The view cannot impute changeableness into God, and it cannot challenge the Trinity. Okay? Now, let's look at the first view. Propagation brings souls into existence. Do any of these three these three criteria, do they conflict with the idea of propagation? I mean, look, I think that the idea of propagation is very difficult to understand to begin with.
Yeah.
Because it seems like to me that in propagation, the being is made through sexual reproduction, and then like the soul sort of emerges out of that life form. It's almost epiphenomenal. So I don't know. What do you think of? How do you understand propagation, and then how do you think propagation fits with this litmus test?
Yeah, I mean, I view it in the same way as you do. It's just it's very biological, and it's like almost like a mechanism. There's something very mechanical about it. Actually, hold on. Actually, on propagation, Augustine actually has something to say for this. Let's see.
Well, I can. While you're looking for it, I'll try to sort of do some sort of analysis while Jordan looks for that quote. So, let me see if I can apply this. If that's my conception of propagation, and God's creation is the only changeable form, I have to ask myself, is the soul evolving on this view?
Okay, actually, I have 2 pieces of evidence that I think might help us out on this one.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and do this?
Chapter 24, Augustine says, "It is therefore more important to ask what the first human being was like when he was created than how his descendants were propagated." So that maybe might point us in the sort of direction that Augustine's really not interested in propagation
Sure, yeah,
at all. And then I'll hand it back to you while I look for that second piece of evidence.
It would seem like if the soul is propagated, the problem I have with the soul being propagated is that if the soul is propagated, it seems to be bound up in the evolutionary mechanism of all of natural life. Mm-hmm. And we know that Augustine is going to think that animals have some sort of soul and stuff like that. Right. It would seem like as higher life forms emerge, higher forms of soul emerge. And then so then you would have this sense of the soul evolving. And the only way that I can say that I can save this view of propagation is that if the human soul becomes part of creation. Mm-hmm. I typically think of creation as being the sloppy biological processes that are the sort of temporal realm. But if I construe creation more broadly to mean the entire divine order, meaning anything that's not God, mm-hmm. then that means that angels and the devil and everything in between are part of creation. It's not just the biological mechanisms. So if I can say that, and the soul's evolving within that very enlarged conception of creation, then I can say that it's okay for the soul to evolve via propagation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that sort of broad sort of landscape picture makes sense. And here's I found it. He basically says that the soul is changeable.
What is it? What's the context for that quote? Can you read a little bit more of it, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's chapter 25, and it's about contemplation of wisdom, and it's contemplation for this is pertaining to the soul, and it's contemplation of the highest wisdom, which is not the soul, since it is unchangeable. The changeable soul also looks upon itself and somehow enters its own mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the question is changeableness there. See, it doesn't, the way I'm talking about changeable is a change in kind, an evolution through.
Okay.
But obviously the soul can change because the soul can be redeemed in the sense that the soul can sin and also can then choose Christ and be redeemed and virtue. Like, it can obviously moves. It's not a static entity, but what the type of change I'm talking about is that it becomes a qualitatively different type of thing, and that's what. Okay. That's what I was sort of worried about. I think the only thing that would be problematic about this view of propagation is that if creation has to be more narrowly defined, is there any reason to think that creation it could be everything is there any reason to not think that creation is everything but God? Like, do you think of angels as being part of creation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say anything that God has a hand in shaping or forming.
Created, right?
That's made, then, yeah, I would tend to put that.
So God created angels.
Yep.
So they are part of creation.
Yep.
God created Satan.
Yep.
So Satan is part of creation.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting little note, Jordan.
Uh-oh. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get cornered here.
No. I wonder if we take this view, if everything as a part of creation can fall and ascend in the divine schematization, can Satan be saved? If humans can accept Jesus Christ and move up the divine order, can Satan not do the same? Presumably, Satan made a dramatic downfall, but presumably there's something good in him. He was made an angel. Yeah. God made something good in him. Presumably, he ought to be able to climb back up the ladder. I wonder if this commits Augustine to the view that one day even Satan will be reconciled with God.
Yeah, I think that there's that possibility, but this is kind of about the devil. Augustine says that, speaking of the pride of the devil, was added a malicious envy.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that, yeah.
Satan might be so envious and so bound up in his own, I guess, design to imitate God in that envy. there's that possibility.
But how many people do we know that are like that too? How many people do we know that hate God so much because they have some sort of tragic flaw and won't embrace God? Mm-hmm. But it's still
there's still that
chance.
Potentiality.
There's
right?
still the
yeah,
chance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Satan on this view is capable of redefining himself. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's getting into a whole other issue. And all right, so I've applied the first category to it. If we expand creation, then propagation seems fine. View cannot impute changeableness into God. Does propagation does that impute changeableness into God in any way? Not on the face of it. I don't think.
Not really.
No, I can't see that.
Yeah.
Okay. Does it challenge the Trinity?
You're coming up with some really good
I think this work needs to be done. I don't know how it would challenge the Trinity.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I can't see how it challenges it's not obvious to me how it would challenge the Trinity. So maybe this view is safe.
Yeah.
Can you see how it would? I don't.
Not really. No.
Okay. All right. Then let's move on to the second view. A soul is created for each person born. So does that conflict with creation being the only changeable form? No. I don't think so. View cannot impute changeableness into God. Right. I mean, you would have to have. You'd have to for that. You'd have to say that if a new soul is made for each person that's born, then that means God is sort of engaged in a new creative act with each human being that is propagated.
Right.
He has to go in and soul it. So the fact that does that in some way, the fact that sort of requires God to do some sort of movement. He's like, okay, I got to go make another soul. Mm-hmm. Or do we have we misunderstood God's eternality incorrectly when we say that? Because truly, and this feeds into the third quality of God being sort of this Trinitarian figure, right? Is that God, as a Trinitarian figure, there is always going to be some sort of dynamic movement between the three aspects.
Right.
So just because
do we tend to basically inject this idea of fixity,
right?
That property into God. When we say eternal, I think that we, for me at least, there's that temptation to sort of keep it as a static, unchanging, unmoving thing. So
you can be immutable, but at the same time dynamic. It does. So if we have that understanding of eternality, if we say that there's immutability to God, meaning that his character is timeless, his nature is timeless, but we still allow God to act in creation and still allow him to be dynamic.
That would seem to complement, right, the Trinity. That
does fit pretty squarely with the idea of a Trinity already being sort of a dynamic substance. But we really, what we've stumbled upon here is that there are gradations of mutability, right, and immutability. I'm saying there's going to be this sort of frozen immutability of maybe sort of like a monotheistic, classical monotheism sort of God or whatever, versus sort of the God of the Bible that is dynamically involved with his people.
Right.
There could be a hard and a softer immutability.
Yeah.
If you want to split philosophical hairs about it.
Yeah, almost like plastic. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, and we obviously we didn't have a problem with that being in jeopardy with the view of the Trinity. Yeah. So the third view: souls exist elsewhere and are commanded into a newborn. I think that reaffirms the idea of God's creation being the only changeable form. I'm not. If anything, it says that if anything, it says that there's something maybe a little bit more static about it than we did conceive about it in other scenarios. I don't think it really, not on the face of it, I'm not really sure how it imputes changeableness into God.
Yeah. doesn't really do that.
What about challenging the Trinity? If all the souls, if all the souls are in God from the jump, like if God's made everything to begin with. See, I could see that being sort of
a whole lot of room for the Trinity.
If all the souls are made at the beginning of human time, does that minimize the role of Christ? Right? Because Christ is needed in human time to redeem humanity. But if the souls have existed forever, then I don't know. It sort of seems like we're assuming the souls have existed forever.
Right.
They probably haven't existed forever. They're not existing in eternality. But like, I mean, couldn't the souls just be sort of saved in heaven, and then they have to fall back down into earth and embody us and then be saved again? They have to be saved twice?
Yeah, it's almost like a kind of like a karmic kind of like cycle. Yeah.
I don't know. But I mean, this is all sort of predicated on the idea of the Trinity being in existence for the sake of humanity, which Christ definitely incarnates for the sake of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
But presumably on the Christian conception of God, the Father, the Jesus and the Holy Spirit are contemporaneous. These don't come into existence at different times.
Right.
So before there are any people or souls or anything like that, the Trinity is still in place. So I guess what I'm saying here is the Trinity is the Trinity. It's just it's the role of Jesus in time may be slightly less valuable if souls exist before ensoulment. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I don't think that changes the conception of the Trinity. It just makes maybe makes Christ's work seem a little redundant. Because if the souls existed in heaven, he could just save them there.
Right.
You know?
Kind of just do all the work beforehand.
Yeah, it seems like he has to I got to go back and do that again. Mm-hmm. I got to go save the souls again. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Uh-huh.
But it doesn't do violence to the concept of the Trinity. All right. And then souls attaching to bodies at their own discretion. I don't know. I mean, God's creation is only changeable form. I don't really see how it would conflict with that. The view cannot impute changeableness into God. I mean, if anything, it may be the fact that he just makes the souls and then they go their own way. I think the only thing is that it may challenge the Trinity if I think it implies carelessness in a little way, right? It kind of almost
right. It's almost I don't want to say reckless, but
I go on these walks, right? I go on these walks and I'll walk across streams and stuff like that. And right now I'm seeing all these. When I get close to the streams, there's all these disturbances in the water, and I'm seeing all these tadpoles just scurrying all about because they're disrupted by my footsteps and everything like that. And it kind of makes me think that this is how it is. Like God just made these souls and they're just scurrying everywhere.
Yeah, that's kind of what I picture. It's like a random or like chaotic. It's just like, I don't know, just like chaos.
It seems a little bit like that. This view seems a little bit like a God abandoning souls.
Yeah, just kind of turn them loose. There you go. Go find some bodies to inhabit.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I don't think it necessarily challenges the persons of the Trinity, but if it may challenge the fundamental dynamic mode of the Trinity, which is love, right? Like God in Christianity is love. And in order for God to be love, he has to have persons to love. And that's why God has to be multifaceted so the love can be expressed. God loves the Son and the Holy Spirit is the love between and all of this stuff, right? Like this is how a lot of people explain the Trinity. It seems haphazard and uncaring if souls are just like, you're on your own.
Yeah, that's the thing.
It seems Darwinian.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention, I mean, just like throughout the text, like it's so hierarchical, and creation is ordered in like this perfect way. So just the careful ordering of creation, and then just to have this kind of like random, there's just this randomness of souls, it just seems to run contrary to everything that we've talked about.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
intuitively, I can't really get on board with it, but.
Well, I mean, the thing is that God very much could devise it that way. Yeah. I mean, it only looks random and reckless to us, but he's like, no, that's how I want it to be.
Yeah, and that also could just be a limitation of our understanding.
So essentially what we've done, all right, I'm done with this little exercise. Okay, Augustine does not do this. This is Luke and Jordan applying the criteria to the souls. I think it's a valuable research paper if someone wants to take what we've done here and go somewhere with it. And we're 25 minutes into the podcast after having done this exercise.
Oh boy.
Is that going through all of this, all the views stand as far as we can tell. But what we know...
And maybe that's why Augustine really doesn't want to dwell on this too much, because, as we've done in 26 minutes, we haven't really drawn any firm conclusions yet. So
we haven't drawn any firm conclusions, but what have we done? We've drawn firm distinctions.
Right.
So I'm just saying... We've created a lot of firm distinctions that would allow for these views to be compatible. And I mean, look, that's where a lot of interesting philosophical research comes from. It's not like you're going to innovate a new conception of the soul, but you're going to connect these dots, and that's how research gets progressed. So I guess what we just did in the podcast here is we just did live research. Mm-hmm. So
cool.
But it's to the public now. Hey, someone go make that your master's thesis. All right.
Help us out.
All right.
Get back to us. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into what was prepared for today. Okay. So, do you have anything that you want to say? I need a second to go over my notes for Book 3, Chapter 23. Do you want to say anything about Book 3, Chapter 23 before I get into it?
Yeah. Sorry. Give me 1 second.
Well,
I would
sure.
say one thing from 23 that I liked was the concept that no human life is superfluous, and that ties into a lot what we talked about a few podcasts ago with suicide and the desire for peace and all that stuff. So if anyone feels like that their life is or their own existence is meaningless, then this is also just another confirmation that their life is meaningful and has purpose.
All right, well, we have to draw, and that is the general gist, and we've covered that before, but there's some differences here in chapter 23 that are going to be very important for reaffirming this point of view that you just enunciated, is that, in our divine schematization, we found a role for everybody, but in chapter 23, Augustine takes up the issue of children who suffer and die.
Right.
Okay? And I had some people close to me recently lose a child, and I mean, that's what really prompted me to study this text. And the reason why this animated me so much is that it seems like such a waste to have innocent children live so briefly but then die. It seems like a waste of a soul too. Like God sends down this soul that is from what we know is going to be stained by original sin, right? Right, is and that represents a whole other problem about infant baptism and eternal destination and stuff like that. Augustine tells us, why ought we not to, Jordan, do you know what he says about why we ought not to worry about the eternal destination of children who die?
I think that this is a huge relief is, and there's a little bit of ambiguity to it, but Augustine says, who knows what reward God has prepared for them, meaning children who have, died prematurely, let me reread this. Who knows what reward God has prepared for them in the hidden depths of his judgment?
Right. Yeah. So you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Augustine essentially says that God rewards suffering that is unmerited.
Reward suffering, or what do you mean? You mean
in terms of a child dying, like not seeing, their 10th,
I
dying
think
before they see their 10th birthday. Because he associates it with martyrdom.
Oh, how does he associate it with martyrdom?
Let's see. Give me one second. Oh, it is not without reason that the church celebrates as martyrs the children who were killed when Herod sought the life of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So the point of this being, I don't think it's that they're rewarded for their suffering. Maybe I wouldn't say it that way, and maybe
that's not the entire point, but I think that's a sort of a consequence of it.
I think what Augustine is trying to say here is that, look, don't worry about your child going to hell. Okay?
Right.
Don't. So let's say your child died at age...
That's a point I totally took for granted. So
right.
Thank you for clarifying that.
But I mean, and I'm going to ask you about it because I think it complicates it with his view of original sin. Mm-hmm. He's like, look, God made the freaking universe. He is capable. So if a child dies before it can accept Christ and proceed out of animality to virtue, mm-hmm. right? God is capable of adjudicating an eternal destination that is in keeping with that child's being, right?
Right.
So if you're worried about your child not making it to heaven or in purgatory or whatever, don't worry. God will be just and fair and merciful to that individual that hasn't reached adulthood, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, actually, because that brings me to a point that I annotated in the text, is that he refers to a life that can be intermediate between sin and right action. And that made me wonder, is he referring to purgatory? I mean...
I think that actually may be more applicable to Adam and Eve, which we're going to get mm-hmm. to in a little bit. But maybe. I want to make a little bit more headway here on this this issue of children suffering and death. And I thought this was probably one of the most profound points in the whole book. Mm-hmm. He says, okay, not only are children's lives who die not superfluous, because God will take care of them and restore them to their rightful place in the divine order. It's not like they don't count. It's not like they're mulligan lives. Augustine says they have a role to play on earth. Do you know what he said? Do you remember what he says about the role that they play on earth?
I mean, one of the main roles is,
their role is incredibly important.
Right, it's to test the parents.
Exactly. The people that care for children who die young, mm-hmm. or maybe you could say this to people that are handicapped or severely malformed or have cognitive disabilities or something like that, I think would all apply, is that it is a blessing from a cosmic perspective to be trusted with the guardianship of such a child, mm-hmm. because it will humble you to the point where you need to reach out to God, right, mm-hmm. for help to endure this adversity. And so the child may suffer for 4 years, may suffer for 60 years. Let's say he's got a severe mental disorder or handicap or something like that, and this child is never going to live on their own, and you're going to be responsible for them your entire life, right? Mm-hmm. Which especially happens with our advances in technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? God is going to say, cosmically, that is a blink of the eye. But eternally, if you find God as the result of taking care of someone who's suffering and dies, that child was the best thing to ever happen to you.
Yeah, and actually, I was looking for the direct quotation. I found it. It's a punishment in a sense for parents, but it cultivates faith and tests mercy. It's
depending on the perspective. If it's a punishment, if there's nothing beyond this, if there's no God or anything like that or whatever else, or if it makes you turn away from God, it can be a negative thing.
Right.
But the perspective changes entirely if it helps you find God.
Exactly.
So I thought that was an incredibly important point. But the interesting discussion question that I think emerges out of this, and I have a bunch of questions written here, but how does all this fit with original sin? Is there not some tension here? Didn't Augustine just tell us there was a baseline of sin? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, all of Augustine's work, in order to account for the way that sin is transmitted between individuals, right, has made it so that people, as a result of being people, are born guilty, are born fallen. Right. It's not like we are innocent children, and then we hit our 18th birthday, and then we are sinners, and then we need God. The way that this works, from the way that Adam and Eve fell, is that the second you come into this world, you have original sin. Right. So then, the tension is, how can Augustine say that God will take care of a child if at the same time he's affirming that everybody is fundamentally a sinner? Now, maybe you can say that original sin isn't as powerful to the eternal destination of the soul as morally chosen sin. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could make that case that these two types of sin, the sin that we commit versus the sin that's bestowed upon us as being human beings, that one corrupts the body and one corrupts the soul. Right. And maybe that's the way Augustine can have his cake and eat it too on this.
Right, and following that line of logic, that's where baptism would come in.
Right, but let's say you don't have your child baptized. Mm-hmm. Let's say they die in childbirth, or let's say you're Protestant. I haven't been baptized. I have accepted Jesus Christ, but I've never been baptized. So are my moral sins covered, but my original sin isn't? Have I only halfway completed the Reformation process? Am I only halfway saved until I get that water on my head?
It depends on who you talk to, I guess.
I know, but that's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, because I was baptized, so I'm good. I don't know about you. I'm fine. I'm set. I got to work on my moral sin.
So you got the water.
I got a head start.
You got the water on your head when you were.
Thanks, Mom, Dad.
Yeah, and I didn't, and you're going to heaven, and I'm not.
Yeah, I'll wait for you there, I guess. If you get there.
Yeah, put a good word in for me.
Yeah.
I thought that was so. I think this is sort of problematic, unless we can just like I said, but I guess the thing is that it. I mean, you were raised Catholic, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know anything about infant baptism. I was raised Protestant, so it's in the Protestant church. I don't know. I mean, look, all the different sects have different theological stands on baptism, but it seemed to be. In Protestantism, we play down ritual, right? I mean, there are things that are retained. Yeah. They're I grew up in a tiny Methodist church. There's still communion. Mm-hmm. There are still baptisms and things like that. But a lot of that is seen as extraneous to accepting Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Are you cool with Jesus? Cool, you're a Christian. Have you been baptized? Do you take communion? None of that matters. Can you say something more about the Catholic perspective on baptism? Because the thing is Augustine is setting orthodoxy for Catholicism with this book, and perhaps challenging it too. How does this fit? I mean, I'm not asking you to be a Catholic theologian, but it would seem to be problematic it's more problematic from a Catholic perspective than a Protestant one.
From a Catholic perspective, and this is just me liking medieval art and stuff like that, sort of like the vivid imagery of being condemned to purgatory. So I think from a Catholic and I'm not saying entirely Catholic because I can't fully speak to everyone who's Catholic. Yeah. But I mean, it's just Catholicism is heavily ritualized, but mostly baptism is a function of preventing your child from going to purgatory. And it's like this idea that you initiate your child into the sacraments.
Is that a real palpable fear in the Catholic community today? Is that what is that something that
today probably not as much.
So
but I would definitely say in the medieval imagination, yeah.
Augustine hasn't talked anything about purgatory.
I think that he hints at it though.
Where does he hint at it?
Chapter
See, as a Protestant,
23.
I'm not sensitive to these things. What?
Okay, so he basically asks, about the people's lives being superfluous. What is superfluous to ask is about the merits of someone who has not merited anything. If there can be a life that is intermediate between sin and right action, have no fear that our judge can pronounce a sentence that is intermediate between punishment and reward.
So you read that
So I
as
read
purgatory.
that. Yep, in my notes I was just like purgatory.
See, I love the fact that you're,
as a Catholic, I was so attuned to it. I was just like, aha.
Well, that's why I love the fact that you're doing this with me, because I just totally glossed over that. I'm like,
because when I mentioned that earlier, you're like, yeah, we'll just get to that later. I was like, but
yeah.
But wait.
Yeah, I think that's one of those moments where you need to tase me.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
I'm glad we could circle back around to it.
Yeah, cool. All right. So maybe I found a way to exonerate Augustine from that tension, but I don't know how you do it on a Catholic perspective. Because it seemed like with what he's going to say here that those children are going to go to purgatory. But maybe Christ.
But then
maybe
right?
Yeah, maybe they mature in some way, and Christ visits them in purgatory. How does it work in the Catholic story?
Oh God, oh boy.
Don't you love it that I'm asking you to account for an entire religion?
Seeing that,
I'm like, hey, yeah, you're a Catholic.
Yeah.
You have mastery over all this.
I'm like the token Catholic person. Oh my gosh. Well, this is like really embarrassing. My CCD teacher would not be happy to hear how much I'm floundering, because I'm much more attuned to pagan rites and
But
rituals.
does Jesus visit people in purgatory on the Catholic view?
I mean, I thought it was like the Day of Judgment, right? If people who were kind of, I almost view purgatory as, I can't believe I'm just going off of this. Oh gosh.
It's okay.
So
It's
many
fine.
Catholics must just say, oh my God, what is this girl doing?
Well, maybe they'll lead to a future podcast where someone corrects us.
Right, which would be awesome.
Yeah.
Purgatory, in my mind, is like sort of a waiting room for people that haven't necessarily done the worst stuff to get sent to hell, but not really quite good enough to go to heaven.
Are they punished at all?
Not. I think it's just kind of like they're almost in a waiting room. They're kind of just waiting like a final judgment.
Is it kind of like that scene in Beetlejuice where? Have you seen the waiting room?
I haven't seen it, but I will.
Oh, okay.
Take your word
All
for
right.
it.
All right. That's the image I have in mind.
Yeah, I think even like Dante might have kind of said that like a lot of like really good Roman authors were actually in purgatory because they were still pagan, so they couldn't go to heaven, but at some point they might get bailed out.
Yeah, no. Kierkegaard has this quote about Socrates not being a Christian, but he eventually became one. So there is this idea that a lot of the most virtuous Greeks or whatever, like they got as close as they possibly could to Christianity without having Jesus.
Right.
And then like Jesus kind of flesh out the rest of the puzzle.
Right.
They got as far as reason would allow them to get there, and then they're waiting in purgatory, and they're like, aha, that's what we were looking for all the time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, look, we're at the 42-minute mark.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, you were like worried that we wouldn't have enough to talk about. So also what's interesting in chapter 23 is that Augustine takes up the issue of animal suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is something that I think is super interesting.
He calls it dumb. So I feel like Augustine would not really like vegans or vegetarians that much.
Well, I don't know about that. I hadn't thought about it. But let me try to articulate what he says. He says that some will then ask if it is wrong for animals to suffer, right? Because like animals, suffering is permissible for Augustine because the suffering allows us to draw closer to God. Right. The suffering that we experience is taking care of a convalescent infant or adult or whatever draws us closer to God. But animal suffering, it seems so pointless. Why on an animal have to endure pain and suffer? There's no chance for an animal to ascend the cosmic ladder to be in heaven one day on this view. And do you remember what Augustine says about why animals are allowed to suffer and how it's justified on the divine schematization?
Yeah, he kind of like, sometimes he gets like, Augustine does get a little sassy, but he kind of said at first that people that assert, well, why do animals experience pain? They don't understand the significance of the cosmic order. And they can't, and they're really
what are they missing out on? What are they missing out on in the cosmic order?
Well, the unity for the most part.
Well,
yeah.
Well, that's specifically what happens to things that are within the temporal slice of the cosmic division.
Well, Sorry.
They die. They die.
Oh,
Temporal things die.
Right.
And if you properly understand the divine schematization, mortality is inevitable within that. But at least the mortality of humans is going somewhere. You have all these other organisms.
Right, there's some sort of end.
Right. There is no telos, seemingly, except for the perfect being of the universe, which they can't grasp. But then Augustine says, what else? What does the suffering do? Like, what does the suffering of animals allow us to perceive?
Okay, well, there is some sort of like an upshot, which is which is nice. And
so you can take pleasure in watching
the pain that an animal experiences is a resistance to being sort of like rent asunder and like torn apart, which is kind of like yikes. I had a very vivid image in my mind with that, and I was like, that's gruesome. But it basically shows that all beings want to be governed by a unifying force and a unifying entity. Yeah, precisely.
So next time you see an animal die, all you have to think of on Augustine's view is like, isn't it wonderful that this organism can feel such pain because God has ordered its soul in such a unified way that it's fighting to live or whatever, and that indirectly this shows God's ordering magnificence upon the world.
Right.
What do you think about that? You buying that?
I mean, it'll make me feel a lot better if I see like roadkill, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I had this
like baby bunnies. Oh gosh, okay.
I had a bad experience with baby bunnies, but yeah, like watching an animal die, indirectly attunes us to the unity of the soul and God's craftsmanship. Mm-hmm. We just have to reflect about it. Yeah.
Oh, now I'm getting depressed.
So, what about your question about vegetarianism and veganism and stuff like that?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. Augustine, he just says, oh, well, you're too focused on material things if you are fixating on the pain and suffering of animals.
Does that mean that it's irreligious to prevent suffering in animals?
Yeah, I don't.
I mean,
I love animals, so I would be distressed if I saw an animal that was in pain or suffering. I don't know.
But does that mean we should stop eating them?
Well, they are pretty tasty. I don't know. That's just crazy talk.
I guess it doesn't. It really depends on what God intended them for, and within this schematization, you could say that they're inferior to man. Yeah. And I suppose that he would probably advocate the view that they should be subjected to man.
I think so.
The question is the degree of subjugation, right? We're supposed to be stewards of the planet. We're not supposed to like destroy it.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of that is bound up in admiring God's creation, but also at the same time like respecting it. Yeah. Like the fact that we are, higher ranking in Augustine's mind doesn't really give us license to, stomp on bees and set ants on fire and
Yeah. I think so. Maybe a midpoint between vegetarianism and veganism and sort of like annihilating all the species, or maybe you can make the case that like maybe factory farming is anti-Christian or something like that. But that's for someone else to take up. We have to proceed to chapter 24, and I have to review my notes. So do you have something to say here?
Let's see. Sorry,
he's going to talk about he's going to talk about the first man. Which look, this is going to be this podcast is going to be like an hour and a half long. This is crazy. He's going to be talking about the Garden of Eden. Here, I'm just going to read my notes and we'll see what happens.
Sure, go for it.
Here, Augustine concerns himself with the nature of the first man. Why? If the first man were wise, how could he disobey? No wise man would be seduced by a serpent for knowledge. Mm-hmm. If he was created foolish, wouldn't this transfer responsibility for the fall back to God? Is God on the hook for creating such an easily deceived being? Augustine says man in his Edenic state occupies a region between wisdom and folly. What does this mean? Okay, so let's think about this for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so Adam Adam is in the garden.
Yep.
Adam is not wise.
Yes.
Adam is rational and free. He chooses to, so he's rational enough to understand God. He's rational to understand that he has been commanded to not eat of the tree of knowledge.
Right.
And he also is free enough to disobey that command and eat the apple anyway. Mm-hmm. But he is not wise. Yeah. He is rational and free. And Augustine is going to say that Adam is not foolish. He's not an idiot or whatever. Mm-hmm. And this, let me read my notes a little bit more, sure. and then we'll try to get our heads around this. Mm-hmm. Since man was not wise yet, he could not attain wisdom or react against it and become foolish. This shouldn't be too strange. Infants don't know wisdom yet. It is silly to call an infant wise or foolish. Okay, and so more on the intermediate state. Man devoid of wisdom could still be rational enough to receive a command and obey or disobey it. I've already said that. So in the garden, we are free and rational, but not wise. Okay, so let's just think about that for a second. Mm-hmm. Adam and Eve were like children in the garden. Yeah. Like, think of a 7-year-old child. Okay, a 7-year-old child is rational enough to devise a plan to get what they want. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't call a 7-year-old child, and we wouldn't call it a 7-year-old child an idiot, would we?
Right, yeah, no.
But they can still be sort of seduced, and they can still choose or whatever, right? They can still do bad things, so we still punish children too. The problem that I have with this, and this is something we did this like 4 or 5 podcasts ago or whatever, is like how we can have rationality without wisdom. Mm-hmm. So because
I mean we said that wisdom is like, perfect in that aspect, but reason is changeable.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know, like, yeah, that's a good question, because reason helps us grasp that the commandments that God gives us is for our own benefit.
Yeah.
But it's the will that's like the binding agent. So,
well, the thing is, if God has given this commandment for our own good, right? And so we don't have the wisdom to discern the good.
Automatically, to fully comprehend the truest sense that this commandment is good for me, therefore I'm just going to follow it.
Okay, so maybe we can conceive of beings that exist that are rational and free, and we're like, okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Adam and Eve were like grown-up children. Yeah. Okay, so here's a question. If we disobey due to our ignorance, does that justify the punishment upon Adam and subsequent generations? Okay? Like, what I'm... Like, so I'll ask some questions here. Was man made... well, I guess what I'm trying to say here, and I'll address it elsewhere. If we have children, if we have a 7-year-old, right, who goes and does something disobedient, what kind of punishment do we dole out to that 7-year-old who disobeys a command from the parent? It's a pretty mild one, isn't it?
Yeah, it would be mild, but ultimately instructive, right?
Yeah, and also it's mild from our perspective. It's not mild to the child's perspective. So let's say I'm your. Should I be the kid or do you want to be the kid in this scenario? It doesn't matter. I'll be the kid. You be my mom.
All right.
If you can imagine that. And so I go and sneak a cookie. Mm-hmm. I'm like, and you're like, Luke, you got into the cookies.
So like, time out.
I'm like,
time out, brosive.
This is an outrage to be put in time out. Like, this is the worst thing to ever happen in my entire life from my infantile child's perspective. But from your perspective, what does it look like from your perspective?
Like pretty just, pretty mild.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's blow that. Let's expand that out.
Right. Yeah. So we start with that.
Okay. So you and I exist here on this fallen plane. Cancer, AIDS, hurricanes, volcanoes. Seems pretty outrageous from our infantile perspective.
Right.
Let's take God's perspective. What do you think? You're God now. I'm down here and I'm shaking my fist at God.
Yeah.
How dare you give people Alzheimer's, God? Therefore, you don't exist. Right. What do you say? If we to extend the metaphor of the child being put in timeout,
like that would be pretty mild in comparison, pretty fair.
So what I'm saying,
I could turn you into a pillar of salt. It could be worse.
What I'm trying to say here is all the suffering that humans endure from God's perspective is like being put in the corner.
Yeah, and like if you think about the function of time too, right? When we're put in timeout, 10 minutes seems like an eternity. Because when you're younger, like your concept of time is so warped. You think 10 minutes is like 6 hours. Like an hour and a half Disney movie is like a 3.5 hour saga.
When we are upset about the suffering in this world, we are essentially outraged, grounded teenagers.
Yeah.
I remember when I first started driving I had like an hour and a half where I like had to run to the DMV to get like a form signed so I could have my actual license so I could drive by myself, and like I couldn't make it work on my parents' schedule. I flipped out because I wanted that driver's license so bad, right? I lost my mind because I'd have to wait another 3 days till I could get my driver's license, and waiting 3 days to get my driver's license seemed like an eternity.
Yeah.
And I lost my mind. I threw the biggest tantrum. So what I'm trying to say here is when we get upset about getting cancer or something like that, and we are upset about it, we're essentially just throwing a temper tantrum. Are you okay with that?
Well, I mean, it could always be worse for the most part, Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me in that regard. I mean, because for me, like what we talked about the last podcast, the idea of, a natural disaster, hitting our town. It's just affliction is a sign that God loves you. So it's something that I'm more familiar with. I don't know if I can 100% get on board with it, but it's something that I'm like warming up to.
It's a pretty profound perspective to take.
Yeah.
I have to say that. So something else that I thought was sort of interesting here in this chapter was that Augustine claims we would have been rewarded with wisdom if we had just kept the commandment.
Yeah, that's all it took. You had one job.
Right, yeah.
One
so
job.
If we had just not eaten of the apple, then God would have eventually made us wise, which I don't
seems kind of contradictory because wasn't the apple wisdom? So
knowledge.
It was knowledge.
Yeah.
Not
well, see, this leads to a flood of questions. Was man made wise after partaking in the fruit? If eating of the fruit didn't make us wise, what did? Didn't the fruit provide knowledge of good and evil? Does knowledge of good and evil not constitute wisdom? What's going on here?
I have no idea.
Well, that's the thing is like, if like the serpent tempts us to have that apple, are we not? Because he says it's like, well, you'll see the world as God does or whatever, right? But is the knowledge of good and evil, is that not wisdom? We've talked about wisdom being. What have we talked about wisdom being? We've talked about wisdom being like this. It being like part of the Trinity. We've talked about it being part of the Holy Spirit, and I guess, and that there are divine precepts within wisdom. So I guess maybe we can't really say what the knowledge of good and evil is, but it seems like it couldn't be part of wisdom because partaking of the apple is what caused us to fall.
And that would make us
It would make the Holy Spirit sort of or part of the Trinity complicit in our fall.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention too, Augustine does really stress this idea of envy with Satan. So I mean, and like persuasion. So I mean, I guess the devil could have just appealed to Adam's sense of pride And, if in curiosity saying, well, I kind of want to be able to see things like God does, so I'll take a bite and see what happens.
What do you make of this? What do you make of this notion that Augustine mentions of God eventually making Adam wise? What do you think that looks like? What do you think like a wise Adam looks like? Because he says, is Adam just would that mean that Adam is just a different type of angel? Because Adam's body would never have been corrupted by original sin. Mm-hmm. Would Adam have just been a different type of angel, and that there'd be angel A and angel B, and all of Adam's descendants would have been just angel B's? Were we angels when we were in the garden?
I mean, we weren't wise though.
But I'm talking about if we had been patient enough to be made wise, like we were maybe at.
Yeah, I would.
It sounds like we were.
So.
It sounds like God wasn't done with us. It sounds like God was still creating us, which could be another problem. I'm not sure.
Maybe we were like a prototype, and that got a glitch, so we had to work out the bugs to become. He's like,
wise. We became I don't know, but then, yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting question about what God was trying to do with us had we not fallen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, that requires us having an understanding of the blueprint of the divine order, but we don't have access to that.
Yeah.
But it does seem like that maybe on this view, God wasn't done making us. Mm-hmm. Which is we typically think about the creation of Adam and Eve as being like, nope, done. I made you, and then I took a rib out of you, and then I made her, and
right. There's a connotation of finality, of everything is perfectly done and perfectly made and complete.
It sounds like that doesn't sound like the whole story.
Yeah,
the way that Augustine says it.
Why would God allow us to be redeemed through his mercy and find happiness through his mercy?
Maybe,
God, maybe that was just kind of a divergent path of, oh, well, hold up, this is not how I really intended humans to be, so let me help you guys, give you the tools to help you sort of redeem yourselves.
Yeah, he's like,
through me and through Christ.
He's like, damn it, you guys, I was gonna make you awesome, and then you had to go and fall,
just mess it up,
but I'm still gonna make you awesome. Just believe in Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You just
gotta work at it a little bit more.
Yeah, I still intend to make you awesome. You're still a work in progress. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Okay. So, I guess the other question is: did the serpent deliver wisdom with his temptation? I kind of said no, and another reason why I said no is that wisdom seems to require active involvement, right? It requires the use of our reason to participate in it, and it doesn't seem to. Eating of the apples seemed a little bit like consuming a potion or a Limitless pill.
Yeah.
And just have you seen that movie Limitless?
Yeah, that's crazy.
What happens in the movie Limitless? Can you tell me about it? I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Is he wise?
I saw it years ago.
Does he become wise?
Well, it allows him to access all parts of his brain.
Okay, so what happens?
So he just. I don't even remember.
Is he just good at solving math problems and crossword puzzles, or does he
I think he actually uses it for evil ends. I can't remember entirely, but basically he just becomes this hyper intelligent person.
He doesn't become enlightened though, does he?
No,
he doesn't become virtuous, does he?
No, it doesn't no, not really.
It doesn't
he uses it for his own benefit.
He doesn't become good. Mm-hmm. He doesn't get virtue.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
Also.
Yeah, I mean, all right, we have 5 minutes left. Chapter 25, and Jordan's giving me the evil eye.
Just look at the clock, that's all.
Okay, the final question in chapter 25. Where did the devil receive the idea that he ought to rebel? Do you want to take that?
Yeah. I mean, there are two sort of routes, right, that Augustine arrives at. And he says it's either persuasion or it's something that comes attention to the mind.
And where does he ultimately end up on this issue?
I mean,
who would have persuaded Satan?
yeah, you can't.
Who would have persuaded Satan to rebel?
If Satan is the original persuader, then he had to have persuaded himself.
And where does that come from? The ultimate source of sin.
Pride.
Yeah. Pride. Satan could discern.
And envy.
Yeah. Satan could discern God and envy to have the same spirit of dominion over man. Mm-hmm. How does Satan fit into the ideas of moral and natural evil?
Oh boy.
God sends Christ as a counterpoint to the devil's pride, ultimate example of humility. Mm-hmm. Okay, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with pride being what motivated Satan to rebel.
Okay.
And I have no problem with Christ being the ultimate form of humility. A God dying on a cross is being like, no, this is how God really is. You know, This is really how God rules us. I have no problem with that example of humility.
Cool.
What about Augustine's conception of evil now that we have Satan? We've got this Satan. We talked about evil as being this deprivation or this privation. Whereas when we choose disorder, when we choose things that don't order our soul, we're choosing things that God hasn't ordered. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about original sin, we talk about the fallenness of not just the human body, but the entire world. Like that there is this sort of imperfection built into it. All of creation fell. Mm-hmm. But then we have Satan as a thing. Satan is not a privation.
Right.
Satan is an entity.
Yeah.
So we spent all this time talking about moral evil and natural evil being a lack. Mm-hmm. But Satan here is seen as a positive force. Going back to CJ's initial question about, in the case of Job, Satan is enacting the evil. Satan is allowed to inflict all sorts of punishment and damages upon Job. Mm-hmm. God lets him do it. This whole musing about Satan seems totally incongruent with everything Augustine has said about moral and natural evil thus far.
I think the problem with Job is the fact, the only thing that I take issue is the difference between the Old and the New Testament. So I think we have to frame it more in the New Testament. But I don't know. Couldn't you say there's ignorance, which is an absence? Satan is like the embodiment of pride, right? And couldn't we contend that pride is ignorance?
So you think of, so say again how you conceive of Satan?
I see Satan as the embodiment of pride, and if he's this embodiment of pride, can't we attribute pride to ignorance?
But he's still. So are you thinking of him as like a metaphor? Because on all of this, he seems to be a person, an
active agent.
A being, an agent.
But if we really think about how Augustine always says that we describe things in things that we can tangibly see, right? Then it makes sense to sort of personify Satan. But it makes more sense to me, more like metaphorically.
Of course, it makes more sense. But I'm telling you, Augustine's contradicting himself, unless we create another category for Satan. We say moral sin is a result of every individual's choice. Mm-hmm. Natural evil is a result of Adam and Eve's fall. Mm-hmm. And then there's this other stuff that happens. The Job stuff, where God allows Satan to mess stuff up. Mm-hmm. That God allows Satan to battle it out in this temporal realm with God.
But then
maybe every once in a while Satan does something in our world. And we just don't know. We don't know it. We either think it's someone else acting on their own volition, or we think it's the natural evil that's the result of the fall. Mm-hmm. But it actually may be indiscernible to us. Satan may actually.
Maybe he's maybe if it's like a Venn diagram, he could be like the overlap.
Who's the Antichrist? What does that mean on theology? I mean,
I don't know.
Is Satan the Antichrist? Oh, God. I don't know. Maybe God needs Satan to bring about the apocalypse and Judgment Day and everything else. So maybe every once in a while, Satan needs to...
You were talking so over my head right now for this sort of theological stuff. I do not have a dog in this fight.
I don't know.
Maybe.
All right. Well, that's what I think, and Augustine doesn't say, but I say it's a problem. If he's going to have Satan be a fallen angel that that has a personality that can, and at least biblically, there's textual support for him interfering in the temporal realm. He's got a problem on his hands for how that force interacts in the realm. Yeah. Unless, didn't you say something about a couple podcasts ago, that Satan had fruits and trees or something like that?
That's the thing. I don't know.
What does he say there?
I kind of am a proponent for him being an aspect of the moral evil. Give me 1 sec to find it. Hopefully, we won't get kicked out. Oh no.
Satan is like this. Is either this generative force of temptation, of inordinate desire?
Yeah, honestly, I think that he's kind of like this. Yeah, the source of inordinate desire. I think. Okay, sorry, bear with me. Was it 17?
Does God use Satan to corrupt our bodies and all of creation? Does Satan do that work for God? Just as wisdom, just as God can enter our minds through wisdom, does God allow Satan to enter our minds and bodies through inordinate desire?
I mean, but wouldn't...
So Satan can't control us. The devil can't make us do things, but...
Hold up.
But he can. God does allow Satan to present things to us, to test us, so he can perfect us and bring about the moral harmony of the universe.
Oh, hold up. Hold on. There's this really awesome... Oh, no. Okay. Shoot. Where'd it go?
I think that might be it.
Yeah. I think... Oh, no. Hold on. Okay, well, we're running out of time, but... Yeah, that's... Augustine says... Yes, okay. Chapter 25. Man had no control over what the Lord commanded or over what the serpent suggested, but he was indeed free not to succumb to the allure of those inferior things and was unhampered by any difficulty because he was established in the purity of wisdom, etc., etc. So
that seems to give notion to the idea that God uses the serpent and Satan as part of the plan.
Yeah, as a test to the will.
So this might lead us to the conclusion that Satan has a very important role within the divine schematization.
Right, and if we can say that he's a part of creation, then even Satan has his own role in it.
Dude.
What?
But then you have God and Satan working together.
They could, yeah.
And that seems like the ultimate heresy. And it seems like maybe Augustine might be lapsing back into the Manichaean philosophy that he was trying to combat. And it almost sounds Zoroastrian too, where there's forces of light and dark being...
Or Star Wars.
Yeah, or Star Wars or something like that, where these are kind of opposite sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
All right, we are limited. Crazy. We are limited by time. We have people coming into this lecture hall.
We are not operating on eternal time.
Yeah. So we have to wrap it up. Thank you guys for going through our course. We're going to start a new course soon on Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. We're going to bring it back down to earth. All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.